There's nothing to think about. Vivienne is upset. All she wants is an apology here, and then we can all move forward. It doesn't have to be a whole thing.
Move forward. I turn slowly. I am not angry. I look tired in a way that is different from tired. I look at him for a long moment. Something shifts not on my face, but behind it, like a door closing quietly in an empty room. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I'd really love to see how far this story has reached and connect with people from all around the world. I have kept quiet for most of my life. Not because I lacked words, but because I believed silence was a form of love. I believed that a good mother absorbed pain, the way good soil absorbs rain quietly, invisibly, without complaint. My name is Frances Whitmore. I am 71 years old, and it took a single afternoon to unravel everything I thought I understood about family. It happened on a Sunday in late October. The trees outside my son's house in rural Indiana had turned the color of fire, and I remember thinking as I walked up, the front path, that the world had never looked more beautiful or more indifferent. I was carrying a covered dish, a sweet potato casserole, because it was Thomas's favorite, had been since he was 8 years old, and I made it every Thanksgiving with butter I could barely afford. Thomas met me at the door. He smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. It never did anymore, not when Vivienne was nearby. His wife stood a few steps behind him in the hallway, wearing an expression I had come to know well over 5 years of marriage. Pleasant on the surface, measuring underneath. Her parents, Gerald and Susan Holt, were already seated in the living room when I came in. I had met them perhaps a dozen times. They were civil people, in the careful way that civil can sometimes mean cold. I set the casserole on the kitchen counter. Vivienne thanked me without touching it. I noticed she had already laid out a spread of dishes from a catering company. Elegant little plates with garnishes I didn't recognize. My casserole looked homemade and out of place, which I suppose was the point. Dinner moved slowly. Conversation stayed in safe territory: the weather, a home renovation the Holts were planning, a trip Thomas and Vivienne had taken to Portugal. I had not been invited on the trip. I had not been told about it until I saw the photos Vivienne posted online. When I had gently mentioned this to Thomas afterward, he said, "Mom, it was just a quick getaway. We didn't want to make it a big thing." I nodded and said I understood. I did not understand. After the dishes were cleared, Vivienne asked if I would mind staying in the kitchen for a few minutes to check on the dessert, while the rest of them stepped outside to look at the new garden lighting Thomas had installed. I agreed immediately. I was glad to be useful. Standing alone in that kitchen, I remember straightening the dish towels on the oven handle, the way I always do in spaces that feel tense, small acts of order to quiet the mind. I did not open any drawers. I did not wander into any other room. I stood near the counter, checked on the dessert, and waited. They came back inside perhaps 12 minutes later. I know because I was watching the clock on the microwave, the way you do when you feel like a guest in a place you were not meant to stay too long. Vivienne's face changed the moment she crossed the threshold. She stopped, looked toward the hallway, then made a small sound, a quick intake of breath, and walked toward the bedroom. When she returned, her hands were shaking and her eyes were bright. "My grandmother's ring," she said. "It's gone." The room went still. Thomas frowned. Suzanne stood up from the sofa. Gerald crossed his arms, and I felt something shift beneath me, the way the ground shifts in dreams just before you fall. "I had it in the dish on the dresser," Vivienne said. "I always keep it there." She looked at me not accusingly at first, but with the particular expression of someone who has already decided and is merely performing uncertainty. "Frances, you were the only one inside." I told her I had not left the kitchen. My voice was steady, though my heart was beating so hard. I could feel it in my ears. Thomas looked at me with an expression I will never forget as long as I live, not anger, but the particular disappointment of a man who has already made up his mind and is simply waiting for the formality to be over. "Mom," he said, "maybe you could just check your bag to clear it up." I looked at him for a long moment. My son, the boy I had raised on my own for the last 18 years of his childhood, the boy. whose college application essays I had read at the kitchen table at midnight, whose first car I had helped him buy with money I had been setting aside for years. I looked at him and understood that in this room, in this moment, I was not his mother. I was a problem to be resolved. I did not open my bag. I picked it up, held it against my chest, and looked at him with all the steadiness I had left. "No," I said quietly, "I won't." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. Thomas's jaw tightened. "Mom, please. Let's just settle this so we can move on." "I didn't take anything," I said. "And I won't pretend otherwise to make you comfortable." Vivian pressed her lips together. Suzanne looked at the floor. Gerald said nothing. And Thomas, my Thomas, said the words, "I will spend the rest of my life hearing in my quieter moments. Then maybe you should go." I went. I walked out of that house, down the front path, past the burning trees, and sat in my car for 11 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. And as I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel and the Ohio countryside going gold around me, I thought, this is not the end of something. This is the beginning of something else entirely. People think grief is something that arrives all at once, loud and sudden, like a door slamming in an empty house. In my experience, the worst kind of grief comes slowly, over years, disguised as small disappointments you learn to explain away. Let me tell you who I was before that Sunday in October. Before I was Thomas's mother who embarrassed him. Before I was the woman Vivian smiled at with that particular patience one saves for difficult people. I was Margaret Whitmore's daughter, born in a town small enough that everyone knew your business, but large enough that you could still feel alone in it. My father worked at a lumber mill. My mother sewed alterations out of the spare bedroom. I learned from both of them that work was not something you complained about. It was simply what you did, like breathing or sleeping, because the alternative was falling behind. I married Robert Whitmore when I was 24. He was funny and impractical and loved me in the way some men love completely, but without much forethought. We were happy in the way young couples are happy, too busy to examine it too closely. Thomas was born 3 years into our marriage, and Robert held that baby like he was holding something breakable and miraculous, which I suppose he was. Robert left us when Thomas was 9. Not in the way people sometimes leave no accident, no illness. He simply decided one afternoon that he needed a different life, packed a single suitcase with remarkable efficiency, and drove away. I stood on the porch and watched his car turn the corner, and then I went inside and made dinner, because Thomas would be hungry when he got home from school. And what else was there to do? I did not fall apart. I could not afford to. I took on work wherever I found it, bookkeeping for small businesses, weekend shifts at a hardware store, and eventually, after taking a night course at the community college, a steady job as an office administrator at a medical clinic. I was good at organizing chaos. I had, after all, been practicing my whole life. Thomas was a quiet child after his father left, watchful, serious. He threw himself into his schoolwork with the focused energy of someone trying to outrun something. I never pushed him, but I made sure he had what he needed. Tutoring when he struggled, better shoes when his wore out, a used computer for his junior year when he told me he needed one for his coursework. I did not tell him how I managed these things. A mother does not itemize love. He was accepted to the State University on a partial scholarship. The rest I paid over 4 years, working extra shifts and quietly cashing out a small retirement fund I had been building since my 30s. I told myself I could rebuild it later. I was 51. Later felt possible. Thomas graduated with honors. He got a good job in logistics, met Vivienne at a work conference, and called me from a parking lot to tell me he was in love. His voice sounded the way it did when he was a child, and had discovered something that delighted him, open, uncomplicated, bright. I sat down on my kitchen chair and cried alone, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of it. My son was going to be all right. When they decided to buy a house but couldn't reach the down payment, I didn't hesitate. I transferred the money from the account I had been quietly rebuilding for 8 years. I told Thomas it was an early inheritance. He looked uncomfortable but accepted it. And I told him not to think about it, which I realize now was the worst thing I could have said. Because he didn't. I paid for half their wedding. I furnished 2 rooms of their house as a housewarming gift. I babysat Vivian's sister's children on short notice more times than I can count, because Vivian mentioned once that it would help her family out, and so I helped. None of this was asked for with gratitude. None of it was received with resentment either. It simply disappeared into the life they were building. The way contributions disappear when they are expected rather than appreciated. I began to notice the shift about 18 months after the wedding. The phone calls from Thomas grew shorter. My suggestions about anything, recipes, finances, plans, were met with a particular patience that was worse than argument. Vivian called me Frances now, which was my name, but it felt strange coming from her, like being addressed by a colleague you thought was a friend. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was what it looked like when your child grew up and built his own world. I told myself that love does not require acknowledgement to be real. Sitting alone in my car after that October Sunday, I understood at last that silence, offered as a gift, is sometimes accepted as a surrender. I had been surrendering for years, and no one had thought to tell me. I did not cry when I got home that night. I sat at my kitchen table under the yellow lamp I've had since 1987 and I made a list. Not a list of grievances, I was too tired for that, but a list of facts. What I knew, what I didn't know, what I needed to find out. The ring, Vivian had said, belonged to her grandmother. A family heirloom. Irreplaceable. She had described it before, at a family dinner the previous Christmas. A thin gold band with a small cluster of garnets, passed down from her mother's mother, who had come over from Poland before the war. It was the kind of story that stays with you. I had believed it completely. I still believed in the story. What I had stopped believing in was the ring. I am not naturally a suspicious person, but I have spent 50 years working in environments that required careful attention to detail. And there is a kind of pattern recognition that develops in a person who has spent decades organizing other people's information. Something about the afternoon had felt rehearsed. The smoothness of it. The way Vivian had known exactly where to look and exactly what to say. The way Thomas had seemed to be waiting for his cue. The morning after, I called my oldest friend, a woman named Cecilia, who has known me since we were both young mothers complaining about sleep deprivation in the pediatrician's waiting room. Cecilia had gone on to spend 25 years as a paralegal before she retired, and she had what she called an excellent nose for nonsense. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of Cecilia's great gifts. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Did you see the ring before that night?" she asked. "Specifically recently?" I thought about it. "She wore it at Easter," I said, "but I haven't seen it since." "And you said she's been wearing a lot of new jewelry lately?" "Yes. A bracelet, a necklace, things I hadn't seen before. Cecilia told me to come by that afternoon." She made tea and spread her old paralegal habits across the kitchen table like tools from a familiar kit. She helped me think through what I actually knew, what questions were worth asking, and gently, practically what my options were if the situation did not resolve itself on its own. "You have documentation of everything you contributed to their life?" she asked. I kept records. I always kept records. My mother taught me. "Good," she said. "Don't do anything with them yet, but know where they are." I went home and found my records, sorted them, and sat with them. The way you sit with something heavy that you've been carrying in your arms for a long time and have finally set down on a table. All of it laid out in paper tuition receipts, bank transfers, invoices for furniture, the check I had written for the down payment on their house. What struck me most was not the quantity. It was how ordinary it all looked. Each sacrifice had felt enormous at the time, a different shift taken, a holiday missed, a repair on my own house postponed. But on paper, it was just numbers. Paper has no memory of what it cost. I made 2 decisions that week. The first was to consult a lawyer, not because I intended to pursue anything immediately, but because Cecilia was right that I needed to understand where I stood. The lawyer was a small, careful man named Mr. Abbott, who listened with the concentrated stillness of someone who has learned that the most useful thing in any difficult situation is to hear everything before speaking. When I finished, he looked at my documents for a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you have significantly more standing than you may realize." He explained my options without drama or encouragement. Just facts. Facts were what I needed. The second decision I made was harder. I reached out to a woman Cecilia knew, a former investigator who now ran a small private consulting practice, and I asked her to look quietly into the ring, into Vivienne, into the shape of things I had been too trusting to examine. I want to be clear about this. I did not do it out of revenge. I did not want to destroy anyone. I wanted the truth because the truth was the only thing that could free me from the story I had been cast in without my consent. I had spent 71 years trusting that the people who loved me would not construct lies around me. I was learning slowly and at great cost that love and honesty are not the same thing, and that the most dangerous stories are the ones you never think to question. The investigator she asked me to call her Nadine called me on a Thursday morning, 11 days after our first meeting. Her voice was the same as it had been when I hired her, calm, professional, exact. She said she had found a number of things she thought I should see in person. I drove to her office on the edge of town, a practical space above a dry cleaning shop with a waiting area that smelled faintly of fresh paper. She offered me water. I accepted. She slid a folder across the desk. I opened it. The ring had been purchased at an antique jewelry reseller 8 weeks before that Sunday dinner. Nadine had the receipt and the seller's description, a yellow gold band set with small garnets, listed as vintage estate jewelry, priced modestly. It was not unique. It was not irreplaceable. The seller had 3 others almost identical in the display case. Vivienne's grandmother, Nadine informed me with the careful tone of someone delivering information they know, Will Sting, had been living in a retirement community in Scottsdale, Arizona, for the past 4 years. She was 83 years old, in reasonable health, and very much alive. There was no Polish immigrant grandmother. There was no heirloom. There was only a story, told with conviction at a Christmas dinner, to a woman who believed it because she had no reason not to. I sat with this for a moment, the folder open on my lap, the paper making a small sound in the air conditioning. "There's more," Nadine said. She showed me the financial records she had obtained through proper channels. Thomas and Vivienne's joint account told one story. Vivienne's separate account, opened without Thomas's knowledge 14 months earlier, told another. The separate account showed consistent deposits and rapid withdrawals. Purchases at stores Thomas had never mentioned. Transfers to a second address in a neighboring city that Nadine had traced to a furnished apartment rented under a name I didn't recognize. She was not preparing to settle her marriage into contentment. She was preparing to leave it. And she was using money that Thomas had earned and, I understood with a cold clarity, money that I had given them to do it. I drove home in the slow, careful way you drive when your mind is somewhere else, and you are relying on habit to get you there safely. I made tea. I sat at the table. I looked at the folder for a long time without opening it. What I felt was not triumph. I want to be honest about that, because in the stories we tell about these situations, there is often a satisfying moment of vindication, a scene where the truth arrives like light through a window and the wronged party stands tall in it. That is not how it felt. It felt like grief. Grief for the daughter-in-law I had wanted Vivienne to be. Grief for the years I had spent explaining away the evidence of my own diminishment. And grief, most of all, for Thomas, who had no idea what was being built around him. I went to see Mr. Abbott the next morning. I laid Nadine's report beside my own documents and watched him read carefully. When he looked up, I told him I did not want to pursue legal action, not yet, not unless it became necessary. What I wanted was for my son to know the truth before the woman who had manufactured it disappeared into the life she had been secretly funding. That's a delicate thing to arrange, Mr. Abbott said. I know, I said, but I'm not interested in easy. We drafted a letter, not accusatory, I was very clear about that. Just factual. A letter that laid out what I had contributed to their shared life, what those contributions had made possible, and what questions I believed deserved honest answers. It was addressed to Thomas. It was sent to his office because Cecilia had pointed out with her paralegal's practicality that an office is one of the few spaces where a person reads their correspondence without an audience. I sent it on a Wednesday. Then I went home and waited. There is a particular discipline required of waiting when you do not know what you are waiting for. I worked. I repaired a neighbour's kitchen chair. I started a quilt I had been putting off for months. I called Cecilia every other day and she listened and did not tell me everything would be fine, because she has known me long enough to know that I do not find comfort in promises that cannot be kept. On Saturday, 8 days after I sent the letter, someone knocked on my door just after 9 in the evening. I opened it. Thomas stood on my front step, smaller than I remembered him. Or maybe not smaller, maybe simply without the careful composure he had been wearing for years, the one Vivian had tailored for him. He looked like a man who had been standing in the rain for a long time and was only now realizing it. "Mom," he said. His voice was a wreck. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside and let him in. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had organized my records, where Cecilia had helped me think, where I had opened Nadine's folder and held grief in my hands. And he told me everything in the halting, ashamed way of someone who is only now hearing themselves say something they have known for a while. Vivian was gone. She had left the previous morning, taking 2 suitcases in the car she had purchased on the joint card without telling him. She had left a note. He did not tell me what the note said, and I did not ask. Some things are private even in the worst moments. He had confronted her after receiving my letter. He had shown her the questions I had raised, and she had answered them in the way people answer questions. They are tired of pretending not to know, with a flash of anger, a pause, and then a quiet, weary admission. Yes, the ring. Yes, the account. Yes, she had needed him to choose, and she had made sure the choice seemed obvious. Thomas sat across from me and looked at the table. She said there wasn't room for you in the life she wanted to build. He said it quietly, with the air of someone repeating something that had struck him hard enough to leave a mark. She said you would always be between us. I thought about that. About what it means to be described as an obstacle in your own child's life. About how easily a person can be redefined by someone with enough patience and enough proximity. "Were you between you?" I asked. He looked up at me then, and for a moment I saw him clearly not the adult who had disappointed me, not the child I had sacrificed for, but the actual person. He was imperfect and frightened, and still, somewhere inside, the boy who used to sit across this same table and do his homework while I cooked dinner. "I don't know," he said honestly. "Maybe I let her tell me you were because it was easier than noticing what was actually happening." That was the truest thing he had said to me in 5 years. I valued it more than any apology. We talked for a long time that night. I did not spare him the details of what I had discovered, or the pain of the afternoon I had spent sitting in my car after leaving his house. I did not perform forgiveness I hadn't yet completed. But I also did not perform fury I no longer felt. Rage requires energy, and I had spent mine on clarity. I told him what I needed from him, which was simple and not easy honesty. The willingness to tell me the truth even when it was uncomfortable. The willingness to hear me when I told him mine. Not a return to the relationship we had before, because that relationship, I now understood, had been built on my silence and his inattention. Something new, something with better materials. He nodded. He didn't argue. He said, "I don't know if I know how to do that." And I said, "I know. But knowing you don't know is where you start." When he left that night, I did not feel the sweet release of a resolved story. Life is not obliging enough to provide those cleanly. What I felt was something smaller and more durable, a shift in the ground beneath me. a sense that I was standing on something solid for the first time in a long while. In the months that followed, Thomas sold the house and moved into a small apartment closer to his office. He paid off what Vivian had accumulated and began, slowly, to build a life that belonged to him in a way his previous one never quite had. He came by on Sundays sometimes, not always, and on the Sundays he did. We sat at the kitchen table and talked about real things, about hard things, about the past and what to do with it. I kept my records. Mr. Abbott held the documents in his files, not as a threat, but as a fact. Facts, I had come to understand, were not weapons. They were simply the truth, and the truth was worth keeping. As for me, I still live in the same house I have lived in for 17 years. I still work because I like working, because there is dignity in making something with your hands. I started the quilt I had been putting off for months and finished it by February. I drive Cecilia to her appointments on Tuesdays because she has trouble with her hip now, and she makes me the best coffee I have ever tasted. I am not going to tell you that everything healed beautifully, that my son and I recovered the easy tenderness of his childhood, or that I stopped hearing that October afternoon when I reached for my purse and the room waited to see what I would do. Healing is not the return of what was lost. Healing is learning to live differently in the space where the loss lives. What I will tell you is this: I was 71 years old before I understood that the most loving thing I had ever done for my son was refuse to lie for his comfort. I had spent my entire adult life measuring love by what I could give, what I could endure, what I could make invisible. I thought that was virtue. I understand now that it was partly fear that if I asked for too much, if I took up too much space, I would become a burden. And being a burden was the thing I had feared most since the afternoon Robert drove away, and I stood on the porch and understood that I was on my own. But you cannot love someone honestly from a position of perpetual shrinking. You cannot teach a child to respect you if you do not show them that respect is required. I am not sorry for what I gave Thomas. I would give it again. But I am done being quiet about the cost of it, and I am done accepting invisibility as the price of belonging. If you are reading this and you recognize yourself in any corner of it, if you have sat in a car outside someone's house and swallowed something that needed to be said, if you have explained away the accumulating evidence of your own erasure, if you have confused silence with grace, I want you to hear me clearly. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not asking for too much when you ask to be seen. Walking away from a story that diminishes you is not failure. It is sometimes the only act of love with enough honesty in it to matter. That is where I am now. Not at the end of anything. At the beginning of something I have not yet named but can feel. The way you feel the first warmth of a morning before you've opened your eyes. That is enough. For now, it is more than enough.